All right, good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to the Brave New Something podcast, episode two. I am so grateful today to be here with Sal Mercogliano. And Sal is actually someone who I have followed fairly extensively, actually, over the course of probably the better part of 2 years. Fascinating, fascinating gentleman. Sal, you'll permit me, I'm just going to give you a brief intro and then I'm going to turn it over to you for a second so you can talk about yourself. But Sal is an associate professor of history and the chair of history of criminal justice and political science department of Campbell University in North Carolina. More regularly for most viewers of YouTube, Sal is the host of What's Going On with Shipping. And the reason that we have him on is because Sal's insights are really into what make the global economy tick. Sal's continual and weekly updates as to what's happening with shipping volumes, shipping problems, really is the corollary to what we're seeing on the political level with trade restrictions and the politics generally of trade. So the unique insights that Sal provides on his channel is evidenced by his viewership. I believe, Sal, if I'm not mistaken, you've just passed 500,000 subscribers on your channel, and that is a credit to your intellect alone. I'm incredibly grateful for the time, and I'm going to just turn it over to you. So if I've missed anything about your background, please fill me in. And then I'll start peppering you with my questions because there's a lot that I and Canadians want to know about the current environment.
No, I appreciate it, Mark. I'm a former merchant mariner, so I sailed for a number of years and then worked ashore. So I've got that kind of deep sea experience doing commercial traffic. I came ashore. I embarked on an academic career. Went to East Carolina University, got a master's in maritime history and nautical archaeology. So I did the underwater a part of this for a while, and then got a PhD in maritime studies from University of Alabama. And I've been fortunate. I a historian who's been writing about maritime history, but then in 2008, I started teaching a course for the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, an online graduate course on maritime industry policy, which exposed me to a lot of people in the industry. It got me writing about this on a fairly routine basis. And then, as you mentioned, started the YouTube channel, What's Going On with Shipping. That was in March of 2021. It coincided with the grounding of the Ever Given in the Suez, and then my first episode was about that. We were talking actually we were talking about what's going on in the Suez, and then it kind of morphed into global shipping. And I never, for the life of me, would have thought that this would have turned 4 years later into what it has been. As you mentioned, 500,000 subscribers. It's been a nutty little ride, and it has really been great because one of the things I like about the channel is I get to tell people about global shipping. I've got viewers that are CEOs of shipping companies. They're very experienced people who watch the show. At the same time, it's somebody out in the middle of Alberta watching it who just wants to get an idea of, why is it that this consumer good all of a sudden is not on the shelf, or what does this mean for me, just the consumer of global shipping?
Right. And you know what? I discern that every single time I listen to you as well. So I'll speak with knowledge about that fact. And to the extent that anyone here is listening, please, please go ahead, subscribe and like to Sal's channel because it's just one of the best out there on YouTube. Sal, I'm going to ask you an easy over the plate question to begin, but it's one that perhaps people who are not familiar with shipping or the environment that you operate in know the answer to. But can you tell us just generally before we even turn to Canada, what's happening with North American inbound trade flows at the present time? I mean, we've had a whole lot of political happenstance over the past 3 months, a lot of declarations about tariffs. What is happening on the ground? What's happening to the shipping from particularly Asia to North America?
Well, what we're seeing is what is the norm in shipping actually is it fluctuates. It fluctuates like crazy all the time. There's seasonality to global shipping, but what we're seeing is some outside forces that are acting on the global shipping forces beyond what is normal. And this has been going on since I started the channel. We've seen this happen. We've had COVID and the supply chain crisis. We've had the Houthi and the Red Sea, but the newest one obviously is the tariffs. This is the tariffs that are being imposed by President Trump. And what we're seeing is changes in the normal shipping patterns. Global shipping is geared to a certain level of trade and traffic. And, during different times, it's expected to be higher. Other times it's lower. Early first quarter, January, February is typically a very slow months of shipping, and then it begins to build to a kind of crescendo going into September and October as seasons get later in the year, as you get closer to the end of the year, holiday seasons. What we're seeing now is it's completely all over the place. What we saw was a massive first quarter come in with shipping. A lot of that had to do with people moving goods in anticipation of the tariffs coming in. So we had a lot of cargo coming in. This in turn has pushed a lot of freight, a lot of cargo into the surface distribution system, warehousing, railroads, trucking. So, if you knew something was going to happen, that all of a sudden a price spike was coming, you would try to buy as much as you could beforehand and wait and see if it's going to pass. And that's what we saw happen. When we saw the tariffs come in, what we saw was shipping begin to drop. On the West Coast in the port of LA and Long Beach, we were expecting anywhere from a 25 to 35% reduction in the volume of cargo coming in. We saw about a 10% reduction in the number of ships coming in. And what we've also seen is an uptick in cargo going into ports like Vancouver, up in Canada, Prince Rupert, down in Mexico, because a lot of that cargo is coming in, being staged in those countries, waiting to come across the border as tariffs are lowered. And one of the biggest issues that affects global trade, especially on the shipping side, is uncertainty. When you just don't know what's going to happen next, and you have to sit there and say with President Trump, you never know what's going to happen next, and so that tends to create a lot of it. What we're starting to see is right now with the lowering of the tariffs, we went from 145% down to a 30% tariff for goods coming from China. Is we saw an uptick. What we're seeing is ships being loaded very quickly out in East Asia. We're going to expect to see a kind of wave of ships come across here. And then 90 days later, we don't know what's going to happen next. So what I envision is we're seeing the shippers and the consumers dip into those warehouses. We're about a 50% warehouse capacity right now in the United States. And what we're going to see is another surge of shipping coming across. And you saw the same thing with the tariffs that were imposed on Canada and Mexico at the very beginning, where goods that had to come across the Canadian-Mexican border, a lot of shippers were buying early in anticipation of those tariffs coming in.
Yeah, makes good sense. So, Sal, let me ask you the question that I think many Canadians are a bit confused about, and that's specifically how Canada piggybacks on North American trade flows. And I don't know what the answer to this is, but is there an economy of scale that exists because of our geographical proximity to the United States? That is to say, I'm assuming that when you're loading a boat for the United States, it's easy to put some containers on for Canada, make your way from Long Beach up to Vancouver, and then do what is effectively a circle, keeping our costs low as Canadians because we're effectively free riding on your good transport.
Well,
Is there an economic metric to this that we need to know about as Canadians?
there is. And one of the things that I think most Americans and Canadians don't understand is how integrated our transportation systems are. I mean, it's very easy to talk about separate countries, but when it comes to transportation systems, they're completely intermixed. So if you look at the access ports, go down the west coast of the United States, Prince Rupert, all the way up in British Columbia, down to Vancouver, Seattle, Tacoma, Oakland, and LA and Long Beach. Those are the major shipping ports along the west coast. The closest to Asia is Prince Rupert. It's actually the quickest way to get cargo into the United States. It's a fast developing port. We're seeing a lot of infrastructure being developed into that port. The key for Prince Rupert is the rail system, is getting into that rail system so that you can rail. Believe it or not, most cargo that goes like into the Chicago area, into the US Midwest, especially the upper Midwest, comes in through the Canadian ports because they take advantage of the rail system there, because that rail system, the Canadian Pacific, Canadian National, which is integrated in with the Kansas City railway system. If you look at a map of Class 1 railways, what you'll see is the Canadian railway system hooks into a system of rail that bisects the United States roughly, from roughly around the Dakotas, Minnesota, all the way down to Mexico and into the Mexican system. And so if I'm bringing cargo into Chicago, I want to come in through a Canadian port. It is much easier and quicker for me to come in that way. If I come into LA and Long Beach, LA and Long Beach is a longer sea route. I have to go much longer distance to get there. I'm coming into the largest port system in the United States, which is prone to congestion. We saw this during the supply chain crisis. But more importantly, I'm traveling on a class one railway system that has constraints on it. Literally two-thirds of all the cargo to come into LA and Long Beach, and LA and Long Beach are the biggest ports in the United States. When you pool them together, you're talking about 20 million containers a year coming in through those dual ports right there. About two-thirds of those get railed east of a line from Dakota down to Texas. And so you're competing for rail space, competing for truckers, and California has its own unique burdens as a state for restrictions that when you come into them. So, Canada is a very enticing area for entrance into the United States, not to mention the fact that even when you're moving cargo across Canada, a lot of that cargo dips into the US transportation system because it's more efficient. It's more robust than some of the trans-Canadian highway and rail systems that exist. The tariff imposed by President Trump very early on created havoc with that. It has actually caused a lot of disruption in that. So if you're moving something from Ontario over to Vancouver, for example, you would typically move through the United States. It was much more efficient to go through the U.S. rail system or highway system. Now you've got to do it solely within Canadian territory because you don't want to incur the tariff. And so that has caused disruptions, and we've seen those disruptions. And a few years ago, when we had the Fraser River flooding, and we shut Vancouver down, for example, for an extended period of time because of the flooding that took place, what we had was an alternative that a lot of that cargo moved into Seattle, Tacoma, down to Oakland. And both U.S. and Canada favor from having these kind of five major hubs along the West Coast, two in Canada and three in the United States. When you create disruptions, or you incur these additional barriers on top of it, it's going to obviously add costs. It adds delays, and what consumers begin to do is feel it in their pocketbooks and in their wallets, and in delays in getting material on the shelves.
Interesting. So let me just go back to something you were mentioning before, and particularly the way that the tariffs are changing 90 days, 30 days, whatever it may be. This week, a new expression kind of hit the news, taco. I think most of us have heard about it. Trump always chickens out. Does Canada become a repository for taco? Does Canada become, using its warehouse distributions and the like, a storage place to ride out what are effectively transitory tariffs, because they're continually being increased and reduced. And so arbitrage just suggests that you're going to be sitting here with a warehouse full of stuff, waiting till Trump changes his mind, and then pumping volume on in. Have we seen that happen? Is that a likely outcome? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I'll speak on 2 points there. Number one, you always have to look at President Trump. I stay very apolitical on my show. I always remain right. No, nobody knows what political party I am, so I always stay right in the middle. And one of the things I will say is understanding President Trump is you need to understand the basis of why he implements tariffs. Tariffs are not to control trade. There's usually another ulterior, larger issue at play. With Canada and Mexico, it was border issues. With China, it's about reshoring domestic production back into the United States. So when you look at that, you begin to understand a little bit of the context. So they're never going to be long-lasting tariffs. Basically, they're mechanisms for some other arbitration or agreement he's trying to get. I do think one of the things we saw that happened out of the supply chain crisis, remember, go back to COVID, and one of the things we saw was a massive influx of goods into the United States and Canada. And that was because we shifted our buying patterns. People were at home. The normal buying pattern still existed, because when you push that button on your phone for Amazon to deliver you something, that good has been moving for 4 to 6 months. And what happened is we shifted that buying pattern. We shifted that buying pattern, and all of a sudden we superimposed a new buying pattern on top of it. So, we were buying more stuff at home than we normally would buy in a normal economy. But the problem was nobody knew when that normal economy was going to end.
Right.
And so we kept shipping over the normal stuff and then the COVID stuff. And then we didn't know what the post-COVID would look like. So we had this huge problem with shipping coming in. And we had those images of 109 ships off the ports of LA and Long Beach. Same thing off Vancouver. We had these massive kind of log jams that happened. Well, that affected the warehouse industry immensely. Sat in many conferences here recently listening to warehouses. And one of the things that's become very clear is that one of the things that has happened is a lot more control and oversight over warehouse distribution. Where's warehousing available? You don't need it in Vancouver. You don't need it in LA and Long Beach. Warehousing can be along the main rail lines, the main shipping lines, the main freight lines. And so people are taking advantage of that warehouse spacing. So yes, I think one of the things you're seeing is Canada and Mexico in particularly are being used to house goods in waiting for the shift in tariffs. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which oversees U.S. tariffs, is overburdened. This is a story that's not being told anywhere near enough. They are forced to track all this material, and the idea is the tariffs should be imposed from the port of embarkation, wherever if you're loading in Sichuan, in Tsingtao, in Shanghai, that should be marked as a Chinese good. However, if you move your good through enough places, it gets kind of washed, so you don't know where it's coming from. And I think that's one of the elements of Canada and Mexico is that that entrance into the U.S. border can be used to hold goods and potentially come in at a different tariff rating. This is one of the reasons why we saw CBP, for example, not implement the de minimis taxes that they were doing. There's a loophole within U.S. law that if you ship something into the United States less than $800 in value, it comes in tariff free. And so this is all for e-commerce. And one of the things what we were seeing is containerfuls of products less than $800. Basically, it's full to the gills with product, but each of those are independent shipments coming in.
Sal, I'm the father of a 15-year-old girl with American friends.
There
Strangely,
you go.
the minimus exemption is the only thing they're paying attention to.
That is one of the key ones. And so what we're seeing is really shipping in flux. So everybody is looking for new things. So warehouses are obviously one of the big elements there. And I think Canadian warehouses in particularly because of the rail system, because of the entrance into the Canadian ports is being used quite extensively, the prepositioned goods, so that when the waivers come down or the tariffs get repealed or there's a period of exemptions, you can flow goods across.
It's so interesting because all the answers that you've given me here today are speaking as to the integration in a North American system that clearly was one, and that functions best as one. We are finding here up north that there is a bit of a divergence in our national directions. And Canada is very plainly with our new prime, and I'm trying not to be political as well. That's
Right.
part of my thing, and please don't take this in any way politically. But our national leadership is now saying we need to forge new routes. In fact, Prime Minister Carney has been very clear on it. Canada, much as I love this country, and I do love this country greatly, is best when it does what it has always done, which is pull stuff out of the ground and sell it to others. And that is clearly where our national strategy is headed. We are looking at pipelines. We are looking at diversion of our existing resources, both aluminum and steel, which have now been tariffed as of last night at 50%. I mean, we have energy production here that just is incomparable on a North American scale based on where Quebec is and its hydro facilities and everything else. And so now what we're looking to do is find new markets for this product. And that directly involves shipping in the absence of our American friends. It involves us finding our new ways in that regard. And I'm curious as to the challenges that Canada is going to face as it seeks to start exporting aluminum, steel, LNG gas. I mean, I'm aware LNG requires its own tanking facilities and billions of dollars of export, but steel and aluminum, it strikes me, you can't really put them into container ships, which is, and containerization is the way we ship. Can you speak to the challenges that Canada is about to experience if we do truly change course to Asia, Europe, and diverting what it is we're pulling out of the ground directly to those parties?
I think most, and I'll make this very general. I think most Americans, Canadians, Mexicans don't realize that since the 90s, we have integrated together our transportation systems along with our, free trade that existed for a long time. Go back to NAFTA and the original, and I'm not going to debate pros and cons of NAFTA, But one of the things we did was create really a very integrated transportation system that allowed us to move goods freely. And as you mentioned, if all of a sudden the U.S., and most Americans being Americans don't realize this, but our two biggest trading partners are Canada and Mexico. That's it. We're very integrated. It's our biggest trade. It's not China as much as Americans want to think it is. It's Canada and Mexico. And one of the problems that you have is when you start throwing barriers up, what you force Canada to do and Mexico to do is start shifting their goods, as you said, in an external way, where we're going to start exporting beyond the United States. Well, that means port development. That means you have to start expanding your access out. And that's one of the limitations I would argue Canada has. Vancouver, Prince Rupert on the West Coast, Halifax, Montreal, Quebec. There's a problem with that because the ports are not geared for large scale expansion. They're just not. And it's going to take a long time to expand those ports up. Vancouver's a huge port. It's massive. It's big, but it pales in consideration to some of the other ports out there. And when you start about exporting liquefied natural gas, you're right. You got to get into liquefaction processes. You got to have the supercooling systems. You've got to be able to load that into LNG facilities. Now, you can get away with it on an ad hoc basis by bringing in mobile platforms to do it, but that's not very cost effective. Same thing for shipping out steel. You're talking about bulk facilities, so you have to move in. Canada has huge bulk facilities for the shipment of grain and ore, but now you're talking about steel. And one of the things that you have to do is now you're competing on a global market too. And this is the other element that you start getting into is that if you're starting exporting LNG on a global market, you're competing against the US, Australia, Qatar, Russia. Those are the big LNG competitors out there. When you're piping natural gas across the US border into US facilities, that's great. You don't have to liquefy it. You ship it as natural gas. It goes much easier. It is much more cost effective. And so this starts raising costs. And one of the things that we've seen happening over the past 10 years is that we are moving cargo longer distances because of issues thrown up with trade barriers and restrictions. What we're seeing is the average ton, the number of miles a average ton of cargo moves has increased. It's gone up from 4,700 miles to about 5,200 miles. And so it's only 500 extra miles you're moving a ton, but that is actually quite expensive. And it's a big jump in the short period we're dealing with. And so if Canada has got to get out on that marketplace, you've got to start competing. And one of the things that we're finding is because of globalization, because we have made global transportation so cheap, the one thing that has gotten me, and I talk about a lot on the channel, is how easy it is to move cargo around the ocean. We've made it almost so that to transport something across the ocean has no cost with it. How much does it cost to ship a phone across the planet? Well, if it's one phone inside a 40-foot container and it costs you $2,000 to $3,000 to ship the container, it's almost no cost whatsoever. And now you're competing against economies where maybe the cost of living is lower and maybe the manufacturing is lower. And so if I got to compete against grain coming out of Brazil or grain coming out of Kenya or grain coming out of India, can I compete on that global stage against them?
Right.
And this is the danger. This is what happens when we start disrupting the normal trade pattern in North America, where we actually created what I would argue a pretty well integrated closed economic system where we were all providing what each other needed. And we need to look more on that level. That's just me talking as, in my perception.
No,
And
but
instead,
that's a fascinating insight. I mean, the fact that shipping has effectively allowed countries to, if not geographically merge, economically merge because it's removed all the costs of getting your product from one place to another. I mean, even though that may be somewhat obvious if you think about it, I don't know how many people think about that deeply and what that has meant for our planet and what that means for us now. I think that's an excellent point.
if you look at an entity like the European Union, for example, the reason the European Union has been so unique is that it integrated its trade. When you create the Eurozone and Europe in particularly has a vast network of coastal and inland waterway systems, much more than the US, much more than North America does. That's allowed it to move goods very seamlessly. China, for example, I mean, you go back to China in the 1300s and you're building the Grand Canal, you're linking together the major waterway systems, you create an integrated transportation system. It's, Chinese are not Chinese. They're a whole segue of different cultures and groups that are brought together.
Right.
And what they do is they integrate. And that's what we were doing in the 90s and the early 2000s in North America. We were integrating our transportation economic system, which bothers some people. And that's, I think, one of the other issues you have.
And to some degree, I mean, though this isn't what we're going to talk about today, I guess economics has always followed railways. I mean, I think about the Egyptian Empire and the Nile. I think about Quebec being settled first because of the St. Lawrence. I mean, we can probably do an entire expose on how commerce follows these natural ways. I mean, Louisiana and the Mississippi. Like, I mean, all of this is the story of commerce directly trading on these waterways. Fascinating. So let me ask you, maybe I'll bring you into an internal discussion that's kind of under the surface in Canada at the present time, but is slowly bubbling up, and I'm starting to see the first news stories on it. Um, I'm not sure how tuned in you are to the Canadian dynamic at play, but right now, what Trump has chosen to attack directly is our car market. And for the reasons you suggest, I mean, for giving him all the credit and he wants to do whatever he wants to do, but the end effect is in Canada, our car market's under attack. Now, since 1965 with the Auto Pact, we have been an integrated market, as you suggest, only integrating more and more. But steel, aluminum, car workers, those are effectively the backbone of Ontario's economy. It's not the backbone of Canada's economy. Alberta has different plays, but in Ontario, cars and real estate are kind of our thing. And real estate isn't much of an economic driver beyond making us all feel good about our net worth. But cars are definitely there. In the absence of that car market being integrated, in the absence of being able to use our steel or our aluminum, if we're tariffing cars as they go back and cross the border, we're going to witness, and we are witnessing, our car markets fall apart. That opens up opportunity. And whether the Americans realize it or not, Canada does. And that opportunity is that the Chinese car market is a more mature car market than the American one right now, both in terms of technology, but also critically in terms of cost. There are products that compete directly with Tesla 3s for one-third of the price. And the only thing that has kept them out of our market has been, ironically, tariffs. We've had a tariff of 104% on Chinese vehicles entering into the Canadian car market. But P.S., a tariff of 104% is not a barrier to entry where your costs are one-third of what the costs are. You're still getting value. What has similarly kept Chinese automakers out of Canada has been political will, because we've realized that we've had a whole lot of jobs that have been predicated upon maintaining that North American car market. In the absence of that political will, because of the recent tariff kerfuffles and political manglings of our leaderships, we now have what is effectively an open arm embrace of anyone who can save our car industry. And there's only one natural second. My question pertaining to shipping, because that's why I have you here, is if Canada chooses to ultimately become a bit more diverse, as Europe has, as Australia has, and welcome Chinese car makers into our market, is there in fact some barrier to entry in the shipping space that would preclude that market from starting up? Is there something that would stop China from being able, through the shipping channels, to ultimately get their products to market here?
I would say that this is a gross miscalculation by the Trump administration on cars. I think there's a failure to understand how the international car market works, especially on the shipping side. To give you an example, there's this concept that car carriers come into the United States, they dump cars and they leave empty. That's not true. If you look at the way car carriers operate, they're very unique. Container ships operate on these set lines. They run routes. And so, you're running these set routes. Car carriers go basically around the world. They basically circumnavigate the planet if you look at the way they operate. Come into the United States, they drop cars off, they pick up cars. One of the things that we've seen is car manufacturers have basically standardized car manufacturing in different plants. You build a specific type of a car at a plant in South Carolina or in Canada or Mexico or in any other country. And if you want that car, you have to basically pick it up and move it. And so one of the things we see is car carriers come in the United States, they dump 2 deck loads of cars off and they load 2 deck loads of cars. And that's the movement. They move around the planet doing that. China has been building car carriers like crazy. These are the ocean-going big box car carriers. Matter of fact, they just built the largest car carrier in the world, about a 9,000 car capacity ship. They're building that because they're ready to export. They are ready. They are looking for that avenue to flood markets with their cars. They know they're building cars cheaper. They now have the mechanisms to move those cars at a much more efficient rate, and they are just waiting for the opportunity to literally drop the ramp and start offloading their cars. And you're right, the tariff doesn't work when the cost is so much lower. I had this argument when we raised tariffs on China at 145%, and I had people in the US screaming, we're going to stop importing anything from China. I said, no, we're not, because number one, it's the only place you can get some of this stuff from is China. They're ramped up, ready to go. It'll take months, if not years, to shift production. Second, even if you're paying 145%, is it still cheaper than any other place you can get it? And if the answer is yes, you're going to get it. And this is a big miscalculation, because one of the things again that the US, Canada, and Mexico have done is integrate their car markets together so that elements of car production are done across those borders, so that cars may be built in Mexico, maybe built in the US or Canada, but parts of the cars, parts of the manufacturing assemblies are done in other areas, so that you can magnify that, especially where you have commonality of parts and machinery across different, if you're a Ford, there's a lot of Fords that have the same components in them. That doesn't matter which Ford you're getting. And what you're doing is you're creating the barrier to that. And to me, I don't think they understand the car market and what this impact has, because the Chinese have been building these car carriers in record numbers. They are ready to flood the globe with their vehicles. And, we've seen this happen before in different areas. This happens where China waits for a moment to be able to do it. They're very, one of the things that the US just did recently was this big investigation into global shipping. This is what was called the US Trade Representative Section 301 report. And one of the things that they looked at was the Chinese maritime sector. And one of the things that made the Chinese maritime sector very different than, for example, when the British dominated maritime in the 18th and 19th century, was that the Chinese have not just horizontally integrated, they vertically integrated. They vertically integrated everything, all aspects of maritime, from shipbuilding, the ship operation, to ship insurance, to container manufacturing, to the container cranes. Everything about it is what China does, because they've stated this is a goal they want. They want to be integrated into the global economy. And the way they see that is through the maritime lens. And now all of a sudden, they're going to take advantage of this. China is very quick to react. And like I said, I'm not going to be surprised to see those Chinese car carriers rolling in to Canadian ports, dropping the ramp, and offloading cars that are going to be cheaper to buy for Canadians than any other alternative that's out there. It's going to cost more because of the tariff associated with it, but it's still going to be cheaper than anything else you can get.
Very interesting. Uh, Yeah, first of all, allow me to. This is my second episode, so I have to learn how to do this subtly, and this isn't going to be a subtle cross promotion. But our next guest, or one of our next guests, is Patrick McGee, who is actually author of Apple in China, and he's written a book about networks and the power of networks. And you can't just build up an industry in a couple of days or even years. It takes a sustained government enterprise or post-World War II sort of restructuring of economies in order to do so. And China seems to have that. I'm excited to hear what he has to say, and I'm going to certainly bring up what you've said here today in that context and pose that question to him. Um, Allow me to be a bit unfair and force you to go a bit afield, but I've really enjoyed your answers so far, Sal, and I'm very curious about one particular aspect. I'm aware that one of the reasons that the greenback remains the reserve currency is specifically because of its value in its trade in the trade of oil. It's just impossible for everyone absent a single currency to ultimately trade, and it would just create massive frictions. I'm assuming that that's equally true of global trade flows. I'm assuming the fact that we trade so much internationally, if we have a single currency that ultimately can be used for that purpose, and if we can quote in those currencies, there is a fluency and a frictionless aspect to us all agreeing on a singular mechanism of payment. As the Americans, if they continue to withdraw themselves from the world economy through tariffs, turning to a bit more of an insular sort of focus, does that and how does that affect the US and its position as the premier currency in this world? Please tell me if I'm being unfair in asking you that question. But again, I suspect trade is a very significant reason why it is, in fact, in the position that it finds itself.
No, no, I think you hit on a very key point is number one, if you look at the end of World War II, when the US, the British, Canada, I mean, US had the first largest navy in the world, Britain two, Canada third, and one of the things that was an end result of World War II was the freedom of the seas, was the idea that you vanquished the Germans, Japanese, and more importantly, you opened up the global trade routes. You made the blue ocean common for everybody. And one of the key things was trade was going to be open. One of the things that the US did, I think, and I'm very proud was in there with 63% of the global trade in US ships. And we could have been the British and sat there and said, we're going to dominate the global trade. And we don't. Instead, what we do is we lower tariffs down to the lowest level ever in US history. And we sit there and say, we want to rebuild the world and provide loans through the Marshall Plan. We sell ships through the Ship Sales Act. And what we want to do is create this massive blue commons out there in trade. And trade is what generated the reason the US dollar, I would argue, became the default currency was because through trade is because all of a sudden you go from shipping a half a billion tons of cargo in 1950 to 12 billion tons in 2024. And that just creates this huge boat in which everybody rises. I mean, look at how economies have changed over time. I mean, basically, poverty still exists on the planet. We still have obviously this huge problem with issues, but the standard of living across the entire planet has raised immensely, largely due to trade. And trade, I think, is the great beneficiary of everybody. It's why you need trade. No civilization throughout history has ever existed as, basically closed in. Yeah, you just can't. I mean, the Romans had Chinese coins found in Pompeii. Global trade has existed since the beginning of time. And one of the problems that I see happening today is that through efforts, and it's not just the United States, for example, what the EU and the G7 has done toward Russia in creating this dark fleet, this attempt to sanction Russia through imposing economic sanctions through use of global shipping, basically make it illegal for the Russians to ship oil above a certain price point. That's created a parallel fleet. It's created a second set of ships on the high seas that are operating outside the norm. This is the dark fleet, the shadow fleet. I call it the parallel fleet. And that's the danger, I would argue, because if you start fracturing the global trading fleet, that has impact, not just for Russia operating outside the bounds, Iran and Venezuela does this, but it has an impact on economics. It has an impact on that global trade. One of the things that we're seeing is the center for shipping has shifted from Europe and North America over to Asia. If you look at the big shippers today, yeah, Greece and Norway are two of the biggest owners of shipping. But who are the other ones? It's Japan, it's Korea, it's China, it's Hong Kong, it's Singapore. That's where the shift is taking place. And the benefit of having a currency, no matter whose currency it is, having the idea that you can operate on a single currency, it avoids a lot of issues in having to do multiple trades. You ever traveled to Europe prior to 1999, you know what it's like to have to travel and change money all the time. It's just a
Yeah.
huge pain in the butt. Euros are great. But what you do is now all of a sudden, if you start creating these parallel fleets, and more importantly, you start bifurcating the global shipping network into this Russian fleet, and potentially into this Chinese fleet, that's going to have an impact on trade. And more importantly, it starts reducing the common currency or the unified currency that we can operate and trade against. And that is starting to happen. That's the biggest fear I see right now is that we're creating this push to bifurcate global trade in a way that we've never seen. During the Cold War, yeah, Russia, Soviet Union had its small little economic, unit where it traded among themselves, but it wasn't integrated into the global economy. Everything's integrated today into the global economy. I mean, ships go everywhere, except for maybe North Korea. You have kind of free commerce happening. If all of a sudden we start throwing up barriers and these trade walls against them, that is going to cause the economy to shift to almost like what it was in the 1920s and 30s, where you were operating with national fleets.
Mhm.
And that led you to unfortunate problems with World War II.
Very interesting. All right, Sal, I'm going to ask you my last question, or last of my questions that I'm dying to know that I wish I could scream to you when I'm watching your YouTube channel. And this one actually only came to me just this week because of events that happened this week. I'd like to turn our attention, if you don't mind, to security. I understand that shipping security is notoriously lax. Canadians know this very well because there's actually an industry stealing our cars from our neighborhoods, shipping them out, and no one catches them ever.
Yep.
Even when you turn to the police and say, "Hey, it's in this thing. I see it in my AirPod," it just goes out. Security is lax with very few of the actual boxes that are being transported being investigated. And yet, as we just witnessed in Ukraine and Russia, um, shipping containers are about to come under renewed scrutiny. We're always fighting last war and or the last event, and the last event here is that people effectively used shipping containers to avail themselves of geographies that they would not otherwise have been able to reach, leading to the destruction of one-third of Russia's nuclear bombing fleet. No doubt America is looking at that and saying, oh my God, there's massive vulnerabilities here for us. And I'm sure every country in the world is looking and learning from this experience. We are going to have to up security in some way, shape, or form. How does what just happened in Russia and the Ukraine war directly affect the economics of shipping and the security associated with that?
Yeah, one of the themes I talk about in global shipping is over the past 80 years since the end of World War II, we've increased not just the volume but the velocity of cargo. We move things much faster than ever before. Go back to the end of World War II, you're loading cargo in a break bulk fashion, basically boxes. Maybe the biggest modular unit you move is a pallet. And you can visualize cargo, you can see cargo, and that was one of the problems with seeing the cargo because the longshoremen saw it too. And so you had this pilferage, this kind of
Right.
hey, I'm going to go home with a few things. And then in 1956, Malcolm McLean from North Carolina, about 50 miles from where I live, creates the box. We were talking about this beforehand, and all of a sudden you radically change the way you move cargo around the planet. The problem, the appeal of the shipping container is that I can load this at a facility in central China, and I don't have to open it again until I get outside my warehouse in Calgary, which is great. The problem is you don't know what's in that box, and it creates this visibility. And so obviously we've got to get better at screening and security of what's in these containers, and that starts with more visibility at the loading points, at the ports of embarkation. For the United States, Customs and Border Protection are in the major ports around the world. They don't wait for that container to arrive in the port of LA, for example. They want to begin that screening process early. And the problem with it is just it's physically impossible to open every box and know what's inside of it. I think the statistic the CBP talks about is about 2% of boxes are open for inspection coming in. When you're talking about 2.5 million boxes a month coming into the United States, is about a tenth of that coming into Canada. So, I mean, it's just the sheer volume of it that creates these potential problems. And so you've got to come up. So there's technology elements, where you bring containers through screening machines that basically x-ray them or give you an idea. There is the tracking, which allows you to flag containers coming from suspect sites. In that, I mean, we've seen that done. We had the largest drug bust in U.S. history back in 2019 with a container ship that came into Philadelphia from South America. They found 20 tons of drugs on it, which is fantastic. But it also makes me think if we found 20 tons of drugs on one ship, what else is coming in on other ships? And you're right, the Ukrainian war has opened our eyes to, and not just Ukraine, but also the Houthi in the Red Sea, about how vulnerable our shipping lines are and how vulnerable our shipping networks are to come in. And we've seen the vulnerability in ports. I mean, Dolly coming out of Baltimore took out a U.S. port, not on purpose, but on accident when it took out the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Ever Given shut down the Suez for 6 days. Those were accidents. What if you try this intentionally? And so I think we have to take a look back at security and how we do that. The problem you have is anything you do that's security wise, it slows up the flow of
Close the
goods, which
process.
makes things more expensive. And so you're always kind of weighing this back. I do this when I look at accidents that happen with ships, and people will sit there and say, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? It's like, if you do everything for safety, there's a point of it becomes counterproductive. When I drive down a highway in US or Canada, the only thing that separates me from running into another car at 55 miles per hour, sorry, I don't know my kilometers, but 55 miles per hour is a 16th of an inch of yellow paint. That's it. I'd love to have a barrier the entire way that protects me from it, but it's too cost prohibitive. And so we're always managing that element. And I think one of the things that Canada, the US, and all nations have to do is better targeting of containers and goods coming into their countries so that we are doing those inspections. We're making it so that you're unlikely to take the risk of trying to infiltrate goods, smuggle material. We're dealing with smuggling right now, and the smuggling we're dealing with right now is getting around the tariffs. What we just talked about is holding goods in Canada and Mexico. That's smuggling, technically. We're dealing with that. And whenever you put more laws into place, you create more criminal elements to get around it. And
Yep.
and we've seen that happen before.
Fascinating. Sal, I can't thank you enough. I mean, you've really delved into some of the questions that I've had at top of mind, that I'm sure other Canadians have had at top of mind. Let me turn the mic over to you, as it were, for final couple words. Do you have anything you want to say to a Canadian audience? Anything you'd like to say about shipping? And of course, I'm going to suggest every person who's listened to this to immediately go and subscribe to your channel, What's Going On with Shipping. If you like what Sal has said here, you can get a lot more of it. He publishes frequently, and really the insights that you get from that channel are really the insights that are driving the global economy. So highly suggest you do so promptly right after listening to this. Sal, do you have anything you want to say to our audience?
Listen, I appreciate the opportunity. One of the things that I try to do on my YouTube channel, What's Going On with Shipping, is really make global shipping accessible to everybody. It's a very niche topic. But one of the things, as I said, I love to do is explain what happens on board ships. We look at the global supply chain. We look at shipping. Doing a story today on a car carrier, matter of fact, that's coming across the Pacific that has a fire on board. The other day, I did the 4 minutes on the bridge of the Dolly. What happened with that ship when it lost power? And at the same time, just this past month, my biggest videos were just U.S. port updates, talking about what was happening with the tariff, and were ships coming across. So we cover the breadth of topics, and I have to think that people are tuning in because the subject matter is important to them, not because they want to look at my mug, because this is not a good image to look at
It
all
could
the
be a
time.
bit of column A, a bit of column B. I mean, come on.
I
Sal,
think it's more global shipping
tremendously
than me.
tremendously grateful, Sal, for your time, for your energy, and above all, for educating so many of us who know very little about this subject, but really want to learn. And you have been a stalwart guide in that prospect. So thank you on behalf of all of us, and thank you for being here today.
I appreciate the opportunity, and oh, Canada, one of my favorite countries to come visit. I'm up there quite a lot. Been to Vancouver just recently, British Columbia. It was absolutely phenomenal. So thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.